You see this picture right here? This is what your brain will turn into if you do drugs. So don't do them. I'm just kidding. That's not what your brain's going to turn into. That is called the blood-brain barrier. And that is actually something that goes over the top of your brain. And its job is to protect the brain from outside invaders. Any sort of toxin or chemical that would hurt your brain, its job is to protect it. But there are some substances that can get through the blood-brain barrier. And if they can, they're called psychoactive drugs. And these drugs could be legal or illegal. But either way, they're getting through that blood-brain barrier. And when they do, they can impact your consciousness. So this is why we talk about drugs in our states of consciousness unit, because legal or illegal, they impact your consciousness on some level. They either make you more aware or less aware of your surroundings. So that's the focus of this video today, is to learn how drugs impact our consciousness and what are some of the terms that we need to know that in relation to that material. So drugs impact our bodies on a neural level. And so in the fall, we learned about neurotransmitters, dopamine, acetylcholine, endorphins, serotonin. And we learned that as these vesicles travel down the terminal button of a neuron, they are spit out into the synaptic gap here. And then they bind to the receiving neuron into their dendrites. And so whatever is not used by that receiving dendrite is then taken back up into that axon terminal through the process of reuptake. And that's the normal process. But what psychoactive drugs do is they somehow affect that process. So in this diagram, we're looking at cocaine. In this specific instance, cocaine is blocking the reuptake of the neurotransmitter dopamine. And so dopamine then is free flowing in the synapse and binding again and again to the receiving neuron, which creates that high feeling. Some drugs are agonists, which means they make neurons continue to fire, they go, and then some drugs are antagonists, which means they stop neural firing. We classify psychoactive drugs into three categories: depressants, stimulants, and hallucinogens. A depressant slows your body down, a stimulant speeds it up, and a hallucinogen allows you to experience sensory stimuli without actually having real sensory stimuli. You're kind of just perceiving something that's not there. We're going to take a look at the depressants first. And the first depressant we're going to look at is alcohol. Alcohol is a depressant, which some people question because they're like, well, when people are drunk, they do all these crazy things. They must be stimulated. But it's not true. When you take alcohol, your frontal lobe, which is in charge of all your decision making, is so slowed down that it can't stop your limbic system from making the stupid decisions that it impulsively wants to do. Okay, so think about all the things your hypothalamus does, or the things that your reward pathway does. So like maybe your friends dare you to do something when you're drunk, and your reward system might think, yes, let's do this. It sounds fun. We're going to get a rush of dopamine. People are going to think we're cool. And our frontal lobe doesn't have enough time to tell us, don't do that thing. You're going to make a fool out of yourself. You're going to hurt yourself, because it's slowed down by the alcohol. So that's why alcohol is a depressant. We know that it disrupts memory processing. When you black out drunk, you don't remember anything because you don't go into REM when you drink alcohol. You don't remember. It's involved with up to 60% of all crime, and so psychologists see it as the worst drug in terms of a macro perspective. Are there drugs that are more addictive than alcohol? Absolutely. But because it's involved in so much of crime, especially sexual crime, alcohol is seen as one of the worst drugs. Another depressant is called barbiturates, and barbiturates are just sleeping pills, and they're not prescribed as much anymore because we know that they reduce your time spent in REM. But people still do take them to get high, and a lot of times they mix them with other drugs to create what we call a synergistic effect, which means that the effects combine. So you might combine a depressant with a stimulant, and so it creates this unpredictable high, if you will. But it's really dangerous because you never know what that effect is going to be. My sister-in-law lost her brother when he was an 18-year-old in high school because he came home from school one day with his friend, and he wasn't a drug user, but they decided they wanted to get high off of the medicine that was in the cabinet, and it was a lot of barbiturates, and he ended up killing himself on accident. And so their family, was devastated, and still is today. So they're a pretty dangerous drug to abuse, but they depress your body, they slow you down. Our last depressant is the opiates, and opiates are derived from the poppy plant, which you can see here. It's a really beautiful flower. If you remember from The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and all the other characters fall asleep in the poppy field, and I used to think growing up that they were just magical flowers that made you sleepy, but really they were just doing a play off of the poppy plant being where you derive opioids from. which is a depressant, which slows your body down, and therefore they were falling asleep on their drugs. So it was kind of devastating when I figured that out. But you've heard about opioids a lot, hopefully, because they're in the news. I mean, not for a good reason, but hopefully you've heard about the crisis that we're having. Opioids are an agonist for endorphins. So if you remember from the fall, endorphins take away your pain. So opiates are painkillers. Examples are morphine, heroin, methadone, and codeine. They're all derived from that poppy plant. That's where we get them all from. Fentanyl is another example. Of opiates. So really dangerous stuff, but also really, really addictive. The opioids are probably the most addictive drug out there. Maybe a little less addictive than crack cocaine, but that's why we're having a huge problem with them right now. If you remember learning about the opium wars in history class, I mean, everybody was so addicted they wanted to control the opium trade. And where is most of the opium grown in the world, or the poppy plants for the opium grown? They're grown in Afghanistan and the Middle East, where all these wars are happening. So a lot of conspiracy theorists say that the big pharmaceutical companies have a big interest in the wars going on in the Middle East because they want to control the poppy plants so that they can make their pharmaceutical painkillers and make sure that they're getting their money from them. The last term we'll talk about with this slide that doesn't necessarily apply strictly to opiates is the word teratogen. So we know that any drug that can cross the blood-brain barrier is called a psychoactive drug, but any drug that can cross the placental barrier is called a teratogen. And opioids are probably the worst teratogen out there. We're getting a lot of heroin babies today. I know my friend, she's not really a friend, but a family friend, didn't do heroin, but she was doing cigarettes. She was just smoking normal cigarettes, was addicted to nicotine, and her baby was born with a hole in her heart because she continued smoking through the entire pregnancy. Imagine if she were doing heroin the whole time. I mean, these babies are born addicted to the same drugs that the mothers are on. The same with caffeine. Caffeine is a teratogen. So you can have babies that are really colicky, which means they cry a lot after they're born and you can't soothe them. Well, a lot of it, psychologists are thinking it's because they're addicted to caffeine because that is what they were getting through the womb. So that those are the three depressant drugs that you need to know: opiates, barbiturates, and alcohol. Our second category of drugs are the stimulants, and these are going to speed your body up, enter you into a sympathetic state where you're not going to feel a lot of appetite, but you're going to be real focused. So what are the stimulants that we need to know? First, we have amphetamines or methamphetamines, meth, speed. That is made of battery acid, kitty litter, drain cleaner, and cold medicine, just in case you wanted to know. Very addictive and not good at all for you. Then we have cocaine, which is actually made from the coca plant, not to be confused from the cocoa plant. Cocoa sugar, coca is what cocaine is from. And actually, when Coca-Cola, the beverage, first was created, they actually put cocaine into that beverage. No longer is it in there, but that's why it's called Coca-Colas, because they use cocaine from the coca plant. Our military actually used to give soldiers cocaine to help them stay awake through long battles because it stimulates you so that you don't go to sleep. Crack is just an adulterated version of cocaine. So cocaine is more pure, crack is not, but crack is more addictive. There's actually, if you want to look into it, a really interesting sentencing disparity between crack and cocaine in the 90s. Cocaine was the more expensive drug that the rich Hollywood people would use, and so they lobbied for lesser sentencing. So even though cocaine was more pure, if you get caught with it, you would get like 10 years less on your sentence than if you got caught with the same exact amount of crack cocaine. And the crack was what the poor inner city folk would use. And so they deemed it a racist policy, and in the 90s they switched the sentencing. And so now the sentences are much more compatible with each other. And then obviously you have nicotine and caffeine. Nicotine is what's in cigarettes, so when people take cigarettes, they feel stimulated, less anxious, they can lose their appetite, and then obviously we know that caffeine stimulates us as well. I think it's interesting too to look at these fMRI scans of where in the brain you are feeling that reward when you take these drugs. So you can see your limbic system is bright yellow when you're doing cocaine. All of that dopamine is being released there into your reward pathway, which is telling you to do it over and over and over again. So these drugs are highly addictive and give your brain that big flood of dopamine. I meant to show you this picture too. This is what it looks like before you take meth, and this is what it looks like after you've taken meth for a year or so. And this one was really famous because she purposely asked for her picture to be in psychology textbooks, in the news, when teaching kids about drugs so that they could see what it does to you. And she actually just died, I think it was last fall, like it was maybe in October or November of last year that she died. So really famous picture of what it looks like when you do amphetamines. All right, our last category of drugs are the hallucinogens, and this is again when you experience something that's not there or you have amplified senses. And so the first one we'll talk about is LSD. LSD stands for lysergic acid diethylamide, and it was invented in a lab, and it amplifies your senses and allows you to go on an acid trip. So a lot of times people say that they see geometric patterns. They could lose their sense of time, so they might be on an acid trip for what feels like just a few minutes or a few hours, but they are sitting in their house high for days at a time. A lot of times your colors will change, the sounds that you hear will change. And so the crappy thing about LSD is that it has an unpredictable acid trip to it. So sometimes you could experience sensations that are really positive and happy, and sometimes you can experience very terrifying sensations in your head. And so there are people that actually who have PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from bad acid trips. It can also cause schizophrenia as well. So definitely a dangerous drug. The next hallucinogen is ecstasy, and its real name is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. It's completely made up of chemicals that do not occur naturally, which is why it has such a super long name. And this is actually a stimulant and a mild hallucinogen. It's known as a club drug, so it helps the hardcore clubbers get through the night as they're dancing away. The problem with ecstasy, though, is that it permanently damages serotonin receiving neurons in your brain. And if you remember, serotonin deals with your mood, your happiness. And so long-term ecstasy users actually suffer from major depression the rest of their life because their neurons physically cannot accept serotonin anymore in order to stimulate them to be happy. And so a lot of times ecstasy users will end up killing themselves because of how depressed they are after being a long-time user of the drug. And then finally, the last hallucinogen is marijuana. Oops. So marijuana's active chemical is THC, and a lot of people would question why is marijuana classified as a hallucinogen, but it is because it can mildly amplify your senses. We'll talk more about marijuana tomorrow, but another interesting fact about marijuana is that it is the leading cause of testicular cancer among men. So just keep that in mind when you decide if you want to smoke marijuana or not. Thank you for listening to all these drugs, and I will see you in class tomorrow.